pretty early. I don't know if you've been following sort of on KSAN and stuff. He's been giving about a speech every 4 hours for about 4 days. Our next speaker is a professor at Berkeley, Peter Scott.
Something old and something new in this program of the Laos Day Committee coming 5 years after the Vietnam Day Committee. Jacques de Cornwall is something new because he represents a kind of contact with what's going on in the world that we didn't have 5 years ago. He's been there. He's been with the Pathet Lao in their province of San Lewa, and he has been bombed in that period by American bombs as well as they. I represent the old, unfortunately. I'm doing the same sort of thing I was doing 5 years ago, and I'm beginning to feel a little bit wonder sometimes about my own motives. But they asked me to come and do it, so I decided to invite it. I'm going to give you what, as I realized when I look over it, is an academic lecture. Somebody's even put a map up here. And not only is it an academic lecture, but it's in a sense about an academic subject, because the realities of Laos are what he was talking about. Pathet Lao, which is the only broadly based popular movement in Laos, just as the NLF is, as our papers have admitted now for some years, the only broadly based popular movement in South Vietnam. That is the reality of Laos. And I'm going to talk about matters which, from one point of view, are perhaps a little technical, a little legalistic, a little academic. I'm going to talk about matters like what the Americans are doing with the government in Vientiane that he has just described so eloquently, and which, if you like, symbolizes the unrealities in Laos. But there's a purpose for this, because the story in Laos, it's hard to believe, but it's even more of a scandal than the story what the Americans have done in Laos is even more of a scandal than the story of what the Americans have done in Vietnam. The big difference between the two countries from this point of view is that Laos is even further away from the TV cameras, and that what was, in a sense, the showcase for what America can do in Asia was Vietnam, and they had to put up certain pretenses, certain appearances. We haven't had those appearances. We haven't had those pretenses in Laos. Let's take two matters. There's a fig leaf for the American presence in South Vietnam, which is we have a few friends there. Not very many. It's a from most accounts, a rather reactionary landowning class, backed now by a growing bureaucracy who are dependent on the American presence. But there are some people who want us in South Vietnam, and we have been working with those people against the rest, against the great majority of the people of South Vietnam. In Laos, America has treated the ruling elite at times just as cynically, just as brutally as it has been treating the Laotian people. And another thing which obscures for some people the real issues in South Vietnam is the fact that it doesn't look as if America started it in South Vietnam, because after all there was a struggle going on before, and the Americans came in at a certain stage, and then you get a lot of legalistic argument about what happened first and so on. But there's very little ambiguity about this in the case of Laos, because the recent history of Laos is a story which has, obviously we can take it a long way back, and really we should go back to the days of the French and perhaps even into the 19th century. But in recent times, there is a happy beginning to this story before the Americans come in. And that is, this is a story which I think you should know, not because it's going to change your minds particularly, but because I think it's a story you should tell to other people. And you'll be able to read about it in next month's Ramparts. Mink Garrett has an article coming out, and I've written myself the New York Review. And although it's in a sense academic, it probably has a certain shock value to people. In 1957, November of 1957, it's the happy beginning I want to take up, when Suvarnabhumi, who was then the neutralist premier of Laos, reached an agreement with his half-brother, Sukarno, who's the head of the Pathet Lao, was then and still is the head of the Pathet Lao, for the political integration of the Pathet Lao into the political life of Laos. And it was agreed that their battalions would be absorbed into the Lao army, that they would be given 2 seats in the cabinet, which would make it a truly neutralist coalition, and that elections would be held, so that we could, if they had any kind of popular following, they could then have seats in the Laotian Assembly. And that was sort of the sheer campaign stage of the Pathet Lao. They came into this in good faith, and the elections were held in the spring of 1958. And the result of the elections were really bad news for the Pathet Lao, because essentially they won the election. It was a special kind of election for new seats that had been opened up, 21 of them. But they were all over Laos, and the Pathet Lao won 13 of those 21 seats. Suphanuvong won more votes than any other candidate. And this, of course, represented a crisis in Washington. In fact, the American ambassador to Laos had just gone before a congressional committee about a month before the election, said, we have a wonderful aid program going over there. It's very popular, and I am confident as a result of all the splendid things we've done with U.S. aid that the Pathet Lao will be resoundingly defeated in the forthcoming election. And then they won 13 out of 21 seats. And in fact, one of the main issues they used in the election was the scandals and the corruption and the class interests that surrounded the American aid program in Laos, way back then in 57 and 58. So what was the reaction of the United States? It was decided that we couldn't go along with this sort of thing. It was necessary to overthrow this coalition government because it had 2 Pathet Lao members in it. And that's what the Americans proceeded to do. The CIA went in and organized a new political movement, relying heavily on the generals of the army, and particularly a man whom Schlesinger says they flew in from Paris, where he was finishing an army course in Paris. Fuminosova, the CIA flew him back. The State Department withheld aid to Suvarnabhumi. Allegedly, bribes were passed in the assembly, and the first thing you knew, you had a parliamentary crisis, a vote of no confidence, and Suvarnabhumi had been thrown out as a result of American intervention. There was no North Vietnamese intervention at this time. Nobody claims there was any North Vietnamese intervention at this time. Well, what happened then, you got a right-wing government, and it held its own election. And American sources describe that CIA agents went around the country bribing, and they did it publicly. You could see them handing out the money. And the results of this election were astonishingly different from the results of the election a year before. No Pathet Lao candidates elected. In fact, in this province of Sam Newa, which was their province, I believe they got something like 6 votes. That was the way the election was run. And Washington thought everything was fine. And they the new government proceeded to pursue the Pathet Lao militarily as well. It ordered the Pathet Lao battalions, said, you agreed back in November 57, remember, you were going to join our army. But of course, from the Pathet Lao point of view, the deal hadn't been lived up to on the other side. One of the battalions in 1959 refused to be integrated into this Lao army, which was now under a much more right-wing government, and that is the beginning of the fighting, not only in Laos, but also in Indochina, in Southeast Asia. The war that we are fighting now in South Vietnam and in North Vietnam and in Cambodia and Laos became a hot war at that moment, and it's an important moment for many reasons. One interesting thing is that year, 1959, which saw the resumption of a hot war in Southeast Asia, not very hot at that stage, but a war. Instead of U.S. investment dropping off in Southeast Asia, a marvelous thing happened. U.S. investment was stepped up in Southeast Asia. As the Americans began to take more and more of a direct hand in backing up the armies first of Laos and later of South Vietnam, as the situation deteriorated, you might think, from what you'd ever learned about the behavior of investment capital, that would mean that the capital would stay away. But that is, in fact, a period in which capital started to flow into the area, where we have now an investment picture where something like 40% of the investments in the Far East, American investments, are in petroleum, and are paying off at a rate which comes out to an average, according to Business Week in December of this last year, of 34% a year, which means that any man who goes in there and puts in his $10 million will have his investment back in 3 years. So it's a very silly question indeed to ask if anyone is profiting from this war in Southeast Asia. They certainly are. To go back to 1959, they had had a phony election in the spring of 1959, encouraged by the CIA, and in the summer of 1959, a congressional inquiry here back in Washington published a report which revealed, on the one hand, the enormous scandals involved in the U.S. aid program in Laos, scandals involving not only Laotians but also Americans. And it also put out what was, for Congress, I think, a really quite incisive critique of the whole idea of everything that was being done there, and it pointed out that what the Americans were doing was, in a sense, promoting social instability rather than order and progress. Well, more than one historian has suggested that it was in response to this congressional inquiry and the very real risk that the flood of U.S. aid to the army, the chance that this might be cut off, led to the phony invasion of the fall of 1959. And a lot of the talk about these terrible North Vietnamese in Laos goes back to this phony invasion, which was staged in late August, early September of 1959. There was a certain amount of shelling going on. After all, the Royal Lao Army had now pushed into Sam Newa province, which for years had been occupied by the Pathet Lao battalions, set up little guard posts everywhere. And what happened on August 30th, 1959 was that 2 of these posts were shelled. 2 posts. 3 of them were evacuated, but one of them was not shelled. The people in there were just told to get out. Well, what happens when 3 posts are evacuated in Sam Newa province, where U.S. TV cameras never get? Well, one thing that happened was that 4 days later in the Washington Post, there was a story saying that 80 villages had been overrun. Not 3, but 80 villages had been overrun by an invading force of up to 3,500 men. And these fantastic kinds of figures, which we're still getting now in Nixon's statement of March 6th. Now, the figure is now 67,000, but it has a history. It has a history as absurd, as ridiculous as this. And if anyone, just can't get their mind fit around the scandal of this order, they should read what Bernard Fall wrote consistently about what happened in August 1959. And Bernard Fall was there. And Bernard Fall in those days was a pretty reliable critic of U.S. policy, because he was, in fact, very much in touch with the U.S. Army and helping out and advising special forces and that sort of thing. But he said categorically, well, his chapter on this subject, I think, uses the words the Laos fraud, or something like that, and he's not the only man to talk in this way. Well, I'm sorry, I think a little while back I said there was an election in 1959. That election was in 1960. And it was only in 1960 that you had a pure right-wing Kuminosavan type government, and a student of dialectics might predict what would happen in result. When you had a government that was put in and based only on a fraudulent election and nothing else, you had a reaction against it. And it didn't come from the Pathet Lao, it came from the middle class, essentially anti-communist officers of the Laotian army who could see the corruption, who knew the election was a phony, and who therefore reacted against it. And this was the coup of Kong Wei back in the summer of in August 1960. And what happened was that Suvarnabhuma came back. And he had the support of a strong element in the army, which the United States had actually been assisting all these years. So America was faced with a new kind of crisis, and there were some elements in the State Department who said, well, we better recognize Suvarnabhuma, he's all there is. And the Assembly, even though it was being elected in this completely phony election, they recognized Suvarnabhuma, So that eventually the United States also recognized Savannah Puma for a second time in late 1960. But there was a trick to it, because at the same time that the United States recognized Savannah Puma, they also sent out a team to Laos. I'm shortening the story somewhat. It's a drearily long story, even so. They sent out a top-level delegation, which included the ambassador who had helped dump Savannah Puma the first time, and it also included John Nicol Irwin from the Pentagon, from the Department of Defense Division of International Security Affairs, who incidentally is married to a Watson heiress of the IBM fortune, and whose father-in-law had been a director of the what do they call it, the Far East American Council of Commerce and Industry back in the 50s, and his brother-in-law was a director of the same Far East American Council of Commerce and Industry in the 1960s. And when Parsons and John Nicol Irwin came out to Laos, it was bad news for Laos. And what John Nicol Irwin specifically did was he went down to Phumi Nosavan's army, which did not yet recognize Savannah Puma, and which was refusing to, and according to the Saturday Evening Post and other the kind of sources I try to rely on for this story, John Nicol Irwin told Phumi Nosavan to go ahead and capture the city of Vientiane with his Royal Lao Army, supported by U.S. assistance from the government, which we officially recognize. See, this is all just a sort of little bit of infighting among the middle class or reactionary elements in Laos. And yet that is the kind of straw and clay out of which these geniuses in the U.S. Embassy in Laos have been trying to build a new society leaning towards the free world in the way that Jacques Cornwall talked about. And Air America flew arms and supplies for 3 months to Phumi Nosavan down in the south of Laos, waiting for him to go out and capture the city of Vientiane. It took a great deal of encouragement. Phumi Nosavan's army was not known as a great fighting army. Most people say it also took the intervention of some Thai forces at the crucial moment, and some people say that it took the intervention of some Kuomintang nationalist Chinese forces who had been hanging out in Laos and in Burma and in Thailand for years, supported by the CIA and by the Asian version of Air America, which is Civil Air Transport, which is nominally a Chinese airline based in Formosa, but is in fact an airline which is 40% owned by the company in America, which owns also Air America. Now, the Laos State Committee asked me to digress at this point for a moment, because the 2 or 3 of the top managerial personnel in Air America are people who were recruited from Pan Am. And more than that, back in the, if you can follow me through all this, the phony invasion crisis of the fall of 1959, one of the American responses to that had been there were suddenly some volunteers in Arizona who called themselves the American Flyers for Laos, is what they called themselves. And out of their sort of zeal for freedom, they announced they were forming a group which would help out Laos by flying for Laos. And they came into Laos in August or September of 1959, about the same time as Air America itself seems to have come into Laos. Now, the man who organizes American Flyers for Laos was an American Air Force Reserve pilot working as a civilian in a place called Fort Huachuca in Arizona, which is a place where Pan Am had a big contract for developing secret, I believe, some kind of electronics weapons. Something I don't understand. It's a very secret contract. And there are many other reasons. It's said, for example, that Air America gets a lot of its planes used from Pan Am for thinking that Pan Am is organizationally involved with Air America. It's very clear that Pan Am got the bulk of the military airlift contracts into Southeast Asia. At that time, Pan Am was the only American airline flying into Bangkok, which is the way you get to Laos. It's very clear that Pan Am got the bulk of those contracts, and in fact, those contracts came at a time when Pan Am was having a crisis of its own, and just a few months earlier it told another congressional committee that if they didn't get some kind of help from the federal government, by which they really meant military airlift contracts, they would be forced to go out of the international flying business altogether within 6 months, which was a kind of ultimatum. Well, they got the help from the federal government in the form of the military airlift contracts into Southeast Asia. And I'd just like to quote you a couple of statistics from a very good article on Pan Am, which has come out in the issue number 2 of Scanlon's, the revived Warren Hinkle magazine from the East. It says you can think what you like about Scanlon's, but you've got to admit this is a good article on Pan Am. In the last year we had statistics for is 1968, and for flying military flights between America and Asia in that year, Pan Am was paid $99.8 million, almost $100 million in 1968, the last year for which complete figures are available. In that same year, Pan Am's Pacific operation generated more than a half of Pan Am's operating profit. And again, if we go back now to 1959, 60, 61, which is when we went into Laos and in a sense into Southeast Asia. In that year, Pan Am was awarded 70% of all military charter contracts. And so that in 1961, when TWA, which did not get so many contracts, lost $38 million, thanks to the Pacific revenues of Pan Am, it showed a profit of 6.3% for the first time in about 3 years. It had been a very bad time for the airlines up for the years 57 through 59. And Pan Am was saved from this crisis due visibly, above all, to the new source of revenue from military contracts flying into Southeast Asia. Well, I talked a certain amount about these historical points. As you can see, it doesn't really latch on to the significant social movements in Laos, but it does tell us, I think, it shows us in a very naked way what America was willing to do in that country. We were not helping the elite of Laos in what we did in that period. We were willing to dump Savannah Pluma as readily as we were willing to bomb the Pathet Lao. And that is one of the ways in which what we did there goes beyond what we were doing in South Vietnam at that period, though later, of course, it turned out that we were also quite willing to dump Ngo Dinh Diem. 1962, the Thais. The Thais are an element in this. We mustn't be racist and only blame America. Some of America's allies in the East share the blame, and particularly Thailand has always had a special interest in Laos. Lao is, from their point of view, a dialect of Thai, and there are far more people who speak Lao who live in Thailand, 7 to 9, maybe 12 million of them, than there are 2 or 3 million who live in Laos. And one of the results of the kind of aid program which was administered by the United States in the 50s was to increase the dependence of Laos on the Thai economy. And it was Thailand over and over which insisted that there was, which was most shrill about the menace of communism in Laos and asked America to help. Well, in March of 1962, Thanat Khoman, the Thai foreign minister, came to Washington and signed a document which has proven very important in the history of the war, though it wasn't much noticed at the time, the so-called Thanat-Rusk Memorandum of March 1962, which said that in event of an emergency, America would be prepared to supply unilateral aid to Thailand under the cover of the Seattle Treaty. Well, it was well timed, because only 2 months later, General Kumi Nosavan's army announced that it was being attacked by Chinese communists up in Laos. It pulled out of a small community into which it had gone, right up 15 miles from the Chinese border, against the advice of its American advisors. And in the wake of this flight from this post where they shouldn't have been in the first place, the Thais said, we're being attacked, the communist flood is engulfing us. And so President Kennedy put 5,000 troops into Thailand. And that was the time when the North Vietnamese, I think, began to take a serious interest, military interest, in what was going on in Laos. It was according to books like, there's a book put out under the aegis of the Council of Foreign Relations in New York by a man called Domme, D-O-M-M-E-N, called Conflict in Laos. Came out in 1964, and he's essentially anti-North Vietnamese. In fact, he was suggesting that America should send in special forces. He said if the U.S. Special Forces went in and arranged for the noiseless liquidation of a North Vietnamese battalion, he said that this would have considerable shock effect in Hanoi. So that's the general sort of line of the book. And yet even he says that it was only in the summer of 1962, in response to these 5,000 U.S. troops in Thailand, that North Vietnamese, he calls them border patrol battalions, moved from North Vietnam over the frontier passes into Laos and took up defensive positions along the Laotian side of the border, because obviously it's easier to defend a mountain pass from the top than it is from the bottom inside your own country. So that is another source. Nixon now talks in his March 6th statement about 6,000 North Vietnamese troops in Laos in 1962. I doubt it was anything like that many, but I am quite confident that the major proportion of those troops were these people who had come in defensively in response to this major U.S. escalation in Thailand. You really can never understand anything that's happening in Laos unless you think also about Thailand. Well, 1964, I'm going to try and make this 1964 is very important. It was important it was important in America. It was the first year of Johnson's administration. It was important in Vietnam. It was the first year after Diem, and the year began with a right-wing coup against the threat of neutralism, which put in General Kang, and we saw a rapid increase in American support through 1964. Same thing happened in Laos. There was a coup in Laos in April 1964, and it's an interesting coup. It happened on April 19th, and just a day before, the three factions in Laos, the neutralists, the Pathet Lao, and the right-wing faction of Kumi Nosavan, their three leaders, Savannavong, and Kumi himself, had met in the Plaine des Jars in order to try and restore the 1962 coalition which had broken down. And Dennis Warner, who is another pro-Western reporter, says that one of the reasons that the excuse was given to mobilize people for a coup against Kumi Nosavan and against Savannapuma was that they were agreeing to the neutralization of the capital so that a neutral coalition government could be restored in the capital. So in other words, this looks to have been another coup against neutralism, just like the January coup of '64 in South Vietnam. And it is 1 month after that coup that the United States starts the hot war of bombing of Southeast Asia. What the U.S. Air Force and Navy really wanted to do, obviously, it's clear from what they were saying at the time, they wanted to bomb North Vietnam, but they weren't being allowed to bomb North Vietnam. And there was a great deal of tension in Washington at that time between the chiefs of staff, or some of them, who wanted to go to a U.S. air war, and the president and his political advisors who said, look, this is an election year, come back in a few months. And what seems to have happened was that although the president in the first half of '64 held the line on the bombing of North Vietnam, he gave a qualified permission to the bombing of Laos. He said you can fly armed fighters over there. If anyone shoots at you, then you can fire back in retaliation. And apparently, a lot of the pilots who were flying those so-called reconnaissance flights complained about their orders, which said that they had to fly at very low altitudes and fly very slow. And they said to their superiors, look, we have got very good cameras in these planes, so we can fly much higher, much faster, and get just as good pictures. But the orders were quite clear. They were to fly low, they were to fly slow, and sure enough, one of them got shot down, and that is the beginning, not the Tonkin Gulf incidents, which came 3 months later, but May 1964 and June 1964, the beginning of the U.S. air war in Southeast Asia, not advising anybody, doing it ourselves and using jets in June 1964. An Aviation Week, which is a very well-informed trade journal, said on June 22nd, 1964, and you can look it up, they said that President Johnson seems to be awaiting the public reaction to this, but then they called it, but it was the first U.S. offensive military action since Korea. They said that President Johnson seems to be awaiting public reaction to this before taking the next big step on the escalation scale. So this was all happening where we couldn't see it, and most of us didn't know it was happening, but it was happening. And it was as bad then as what Jacques de Cornwall was talking about. And I made one big mistake in this article, which has just come out in the New York Review of Books, because I didn't realize just how serious, just how total was the kind of bombing that went on in Laos that we didn't know about way back in the second half of 1964. But there are statistics which say that already by the middle of 1965 we had generated something like 150 to 160,000 refugees in Laos. And if I can just make these figures come home to you, when we talk about 600,000, 700,000 refugees in Laos, nobody knows for sure how many people there are in Laos because there hasn't been a census there. But it's something like 2.5, 3 million people, maybe 4 million people. So we're dealing in the order here of maybe a quarter or a third of the whole population. You know, if you can remember what people like Scalapino and Wodowski were always saying in 1964, they said, try multiplying the terrorist statistics in South Vietnam on an American scale and to get some picture of what it means. Well, this is a third of the population of Laos possibly living in refugee camps, or maybe you should call them concentration camps, resettlement camps, whatever you like, in the valley around Vientiane. That is the kind of operation that went on, and it was only after that kind of bombing started. It was only after that kind of bombing started that for the first time we get substantive reports of North Vietnamese combat battalions. After all, what could the Pathet Lao do? Originally they were in a political struggle, and they had been forced in 1959 into a military opposition for which they were not very well prepared. And then in 64, they are now, thanks largely to U.S. incompetence, much stronger than they were before, and they are fighting at times at least, a kind of military insurrection. And the United States starts this total bombing policy. Well, as Jacques de Cornwall has described to you the results, and maybe these results were intended, I don't know. That maybe they knew from the very beginning that they wanted to separate the fish from the ocean, way back in 1964, and to get rid of the population in that area so that the guerrilla units would not be able to survive. So it certainly doesn't surprise me that there are now reports of North Vietnamese combat battalions up there in Sam Nay province. But inasmuch as Nixon was always saying we're just trying to save American lives down in South Vietnam, let me drive home this point that de Cornwall was making.
This is the Ho Chi Minh here. Comes in Utah Pass down here. This is Sam Nay province up here. And
there are two things about Sam Nay province. On the one hand, it is the capital of the Pathet Lao resistance, but it is also the area where the CIA has been arming, advising, supplying male guerrilla tribesmen since 1960, since we told Pumino Savan to move against Suvarnabhumi. And not only have we been arming them to move against the Pathet Lao in that area, but Jack Kwasi has reported to the LA Times that they've also been used to move into North Vietnam. And finally, as de Cornwall told us, there was more than one, Pati and Nakam, at least two forward communications bases which were used for the all-weather bombing of North Vietnam. So really, Nixon, who knows all this, has considerable chutzpah when he comes out with a March 6th statement, which says that North Vietnam has nothing to fear as long as it stays within its own borders. I mean, there's been 6 years of this, 10 years of the CIA operations with the Mayo tribesmen, and he knows it. And so finally, I'm going to stop, and if anyone wants to ask questions, that's fine. But, what alarms me about this March 6th statement of his on Laos, and the reason that I've sort of argued with some of the points that it's raised, is that this statement looks to me suspiciously like the white paper which came out on South Vietnam back in early 1965. That was a point when Johnson had finally decided in early 65, yes, he was going to go ahead and bomb North Vietnam, and and many other things as well. In effect, Americanize the war. And the first thing they did was escalate the infiltration estimates. They almost doubled their estimates of the number of North Vietnamese allegedly coming down into South Vietnam. They talked about, and they named, in fact, entire North Vietnamese battalions. They named them by number. They said they're now operating in South Vietnam. 6 months later, McNamara, in a press conference, talked about he had found a real North Vietnamese battalion operating 6 months later, and he made it quite clear this is the first one they'd run across. But of course, 6 months later, everything had changed, because by then we had a regular air war in Southeast Asia, and we also had a regular American ground war on the ground, so that this little sort of academic point that, in fact, there hadn't been a North Vietnamese battalion back when we started the bombing really was academic at that stage. Well, this March 6th statement of President Nixon strikes me as similar in this respect. For some time now, the Department of Defense has been cruising along on this really incredible figure of 50,000 North Vietnamese troops. They must think that the North Vietnamese can do everything. They're threatening Thailand, they're about to take over Cambodia, they've been, justified this kind of American operation in South Vietnam for years. We threw them off at a rate of 3,000 a week. So that they, for a long time, they'd had this figure of 50,000, and suddenly it's 67,000. That is, to me, a familiar phenomenon. It's what happened in early, you see, this is the dry season coming up when you make your big push in 3 months, particularly in Laos, because by about the end of May or early June, the rain of the monsoon comes in and everybody just digs in and stays where they are for another 6 months. And it's very alarming to me to see once again, just as we've seen in South Vietnam, an escalation of the infiltration statistics, because what he has come out with in this March 6th statement on Laos is not just a false picture of an American response to North Vietnamese subversion and invasion of Laos, which is what he calls it, but it's an argument for escalation. And when I wrote a reply for it for the New York Review, I didn't know what the escalation was going to be, but I said it looks bad. And then, of course, about 3 days later, we had this coup in Cambodia. We had a coup headed by a general, Lon Nol, who has been known for years to be very pro-American, to be anxious for Sihanouk's job, to have been in touch with Americans. And I don't know, I can't say that the Americans said, okay, Lon Nol, today's the day. But even CBS pointed out that it was very curious that on the day of the coup, U.S. Army units were moved up to the Cambodian border into very extreme forward positions. So it looks like we may have a real Indochina war again, and I think it's terribly important in terms of the current political talk of Vietnamization in this country, which Nixon has been asking us to look at the war where the TV camera used to be in the past. They're not usually there so much nowadays. But to think about the ground war in South Vietnam and say, look, we're Vietnamizing it, we have to be very conscious of the kind of bombing, the kind of air war which has been going on behind the scenes, so to speak, up in Laos, and which I think is intended for the whole of Indochina, so that Cambodian sanctuaries will sooner or later prove incompatible with this kind of air war strategy. And as I say, it's very important to remain fully conscious of what the Americans have been doing in this very distant country, because it isn't just a Vietnam War. It is obviously a war not just for Indochina, but really for who will dominate the Far East, and particularly whether those areas will find their own allies, their own neighbors, their own trading partners, or whether there will be a pattern imposed on them by our country. Thank you very much.
Maybe while we're collecting the money, we can take a few questions of Peter. I think John has already left. He has a plane connection to money.
I'm getting a place. This is my home address. You want my phone number? It's 412. I'll be paying less than half an hour.
Well, you know, CNO has been given something of a good press by Senator Mansfield and CBS and so on. But I wonder, the sort of rather black-white cynical estimate that Ducournau made for the chances of neutralism in Laos, I wonder if the same sort of thing isn't happening, perhaps not quite to so clear an extent, in Cambodia as well. That for some years now, you see, the Cambodian economy has not been prospering. There was a lot of talk, a lot of emphasis put on education. A lot of people have been educated, they're coming out of the schools, and there are no jobs for them. And in fact, the Cornwall tells me that many of them would starve if it wasn't for the Cambodian Buddhist custom of putting up bowls of rice in the temples. And when you've seen on TV all these college people cheering and lining up to join the army, it isn't because their hearts are full of love of their country and they just can't wait to fight the North Vietnamese. It's because Long Nol is going to open up the army, and this is some kind of short-term solution to the economic crisis in Cambodia, and particularly a way of dealing with all of these unemployed supposed elites. So that there's a kind of slowly decaying situation, and has been for some time in Cambodia. Not as acute as in Indonesia under Sukarno, mostly because Cambodia produces a great deal of food, it has a relatively small population, so most people get along. But there is a kind of stagnation which has produced among the more educated elements in recent years a tendency to polarize. And Sihanouk's own party, which is supposed to be the one party for ruling Cambodia, has been polarizing left-wing and right-wing elements. And Sihanouk has been very aware of this. He promoted Lon Nol from Minister of Defense to be Prime Minister because he thought it was safer to have him not at the head of the army. And there were rumors of a coup way back in November 1966. And Sihanouk did then what he did this time. It's, I think, no coincidence. He split. He got out of the country. And I think it was rather clever for him to do that, because he rode out of the storm, waited to see what happened, and if there had been a coup then, I suppose he would have done what he did do this time when there was a coup, that's to say, go to China and try to come back. There is I think a certain amount of genuine peasant support for Sihanouk, because he did the sort of thing that you can see Castro doing in Saul Lando's movie. He went around in the country and he would get out of his car and pick up a shovel and put a couple of rocks on the highway and so on. So he had a certain amount of popular following, but it doesn't represent, I think, an organized structural base for some kind of third neutralist force in Cambodia. It's just simply the personal popularity of Sihanouk. There was a great deal of corruption around him, perhaps not involving him personally, but certainly involving his family. And so it's just too depressingly like the story that's happened in other areas. I think if there is so little hope for neutralist tendencies in these countries, it's precisely because the United States has put such an emphasis on military aid and so on in these countries. And in all of these countries, the domino theory really works. Whereas if you move just a little bit further west, for example, to a country like Burma, which made the very wise decision years ago, way back in the early 50s, just not to have anything to do with American aid. In a country like that, even though it is on the Chinese border, neutralism seems to be possible. But in the countries where America has been messing around for 2 decades, I'm not sure that it is. Yes? This is the Pati base, which fell on March the 11th, and the announcement was made on March 30th. Now, I personally, everyone has his own theory. My personal theory is that Johnson made all those announcements because the dollar was threatened as it had never been threatened before in the history of the dollar. There's a British book out that says in the month of March 1968, European banks were refusing to cash American travelers' checks. And that's like, that's like going into church and seeing that the Holy Mother of God isn't over the altar or something. It was a moment of truth for the American government.
We'll take some more questions at the end.